I stood in front of the coffee machine, which refused to cooperate, and felt everything inside me tighten. A month ago, I had moved to Seattle, leaving my old life in Ohio for something new, but the city seemed to press down on me. The noise of the streets, endless work calls, loneliness in my rented apartment, it all blended into one unbearable moment. I pressed the machine's button again, hoping it would spring to life, but the screen just blinked and showed an error. My fingers curled into a fist, and I muttered a curse under my breath, trying not to draw attention. The cafe around me buzzed. People chatted, book pages rustled, the smell of coffee hung in the air. I felt like an outsider, like I'd stumbled into someone else's story. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, even though it was cool outside. I glanced at the line behind me. Nobody was looking, everyone caught up in their own world. I started to step back, but something made me turn around. At a nearby table sat a guy laughing with someone, his voice low and warm. His dark hair fell over his forehead, and his smile felt so genuine that I froze for a second. Our eyes met, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. His eyes, dark and attentive, lingered on me a little longer than necessary. Warmth spread through my chest, though I couldn't figure out why. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, and went back to his conversation. I turned away, my heart beating faster than it should. I went back to the machine, but it didn't feel as important anymore. My thoughts tangled. Who was he? Why did I even notice him? I'm not the type to strike up conversations in cafes, especially after everything I've been through. Back in Ohio, I had a few relationships, but they all ended the same way. I shut down, not letting anyone in. Here in Seattle, I promised myself I'd focus on my writing, on a new life, not on people. But that glance, so brief, cracked the walls I'd built. I didn't know what to do with it. I ended up ordering coffee from the barista, Lila, who talked nonstop. She noticed my tension and winked, saying the machine always breaks at the worst time. I smiled, but my mind was elsewhere. I sat at a table by the window, opened my laptop, but couldn't write. My eyes kept drifting back to that guy. He was flipping through a book now, his friend gone. Something about his calm, the way he carried himself, drew me in. I caught myself wondering what he was thinking about. It was stupid, illogical, but I couldn't stop looking. When I left, he glanced at me again. This time, he gave a small smile, and I felt something inside me shift. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face, but I could still feel the warmth of his gaze. For the first time in a month, I didn't feel completely alone. I didn't know if I'd see him again, but I wanted to. I really wanted to. I went back to the cafe a couple of days later, though I didn't really need coffee. Truth is, I was hoping to see that guy again, the one whose glance stuck in my head. The cafe was buzzing as usual, the smell of fresh brewed coffee, laughter, the rustle of pages. I stood by that same broken coffee machine, pretending to figure it out, even though I knew it was hopeless. My fingers fidgeted with the edge of my sleeve, and my mind kept spinning, what am I even doing? Moving to Seattle was supposed to be about writing, about a new life, not about random strangers. But there I was, scanning the room for a familiar face. Then I heard a voice behind me, low and slightly teasing, that thing's letting you down again, huh? I turned around, and there he was, with that same warm smile that made my heart skip an extra beat. He wore a worn denim jacket, a small camera hanging around his neck, and looked like he belonged in this cafe. I'm Marco, he said, extending his hand, and I, after a brief pause, shook it. His palm was warm, his grip confident but not pushy. I gave my name, Ethan, and felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a bit. We started talking, and the conversation flowed so easily, like we'd known each other for years. Marco shared that he's a street photographer, capturing people who don't know they're in the frame. There's something honest about how people look when they're not posing, he said, his eyes lighting up. I told him I write novels, though I'm stuck on the first chapter. He didn't ask the usual, what's your book about question. Instead, he asked what inspires me. I froze because nobody had asked me that in a long time. We ordered coffee from Lila, who winked at me like she knew something I didn't. We sat at a table by the window, and the conversation shifted from work to life. Marco talked about moving to Seattle 5 years ago, how the city felt cold at first but eventually became home. I admitted I still feel like an outsider, that the city's too loud, too fast. He nodded like he got it and said, "Give it time, it'll let you in." His words felt so genuine that I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a month. Our coffee went cold, but we kept sitting there, jumping from one topic to another. Marco told a funny story about shooting pigeons and almost ending up in a police report. I shared how I tried riding in a park in Ohio and got attacked by a squirrel. We were cracking up, and I realized I wasn't thinking about my problems, a first in forever. When it was time to go, Marco said, "I'm usually here in the mornings, but, I could rethink my traditions." His smile was a little sly, and I felt my face warm up. I stepped outside, and Seattle's cold air didn't feel as hostile anymore. I didn't know what would happen next, but I felt like I wanted to find out. Marco was the first person I'd talked to so freely, and it scared me, but in a good way. I couldn't stop thinking about Marco, and it was throwing me off balance. 2 days later, I found myself back at the cafe, though coffee was just an excuse. I was there because I wanted to see him, and that thought made my heart race. The cafe was as noisy as ever, people chatting, Lila humming behind the counter, the smell of fresh pastries mixing with coffee. I grabbed a table by the window, opened my laptop, but my eyes kept scanning the room. When I spotted Marco sitting in the corner with his camera, my breath caught. He looked up, saw me, and smiled like he'd been waiting. He walked over, holding 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of me. "Figured you'd want something better than what that machine spits out," he said with a slight smirk. I thanked him, feeling my face warm from his gesture. We started talking, and it felt just as easy as last time. Marco shared about his latest shoot, how he waited hours for the perfect light to capture an old man feeding pigeons. I told him I tried writing yesterday but ended up staring at the ceiling, thinking about how everything in Seattle feels foreign. He listened closely, nodding, and I could tell he actually cared. We decided to take a walk because the cafe started feeling too small. Seattle streets were alive, cars honking, people rushing by, but with Marco, the city seemed less hostile. We wandered through Capitol Hill, passing colorful storefronts and street musicians. Marco stopped to snap photos, a graffiti-covered wall, an old lady in a huge hat. He showed me a couple of shots on his camera's screen, and I was amazed at how he found beauty in the ordinary. I told him so, and he laughed, saying, "You do the same thing, just with words instead of pictures." We talked about life, about fears, about what keeps us stuck. I admitted I moved to Seattle because everything in Ohio felt like a dead end. My job, my relationships, even myself. Marco nodded and said he came here running from his past, from people who didn't accept him for who he was. His voice got quieter, and I knew he was sharing something personal. I didn't push, but I felt something real growing between us. Before we parted, Marco mentioned his friend's art exhibition at a gallery in a couple of days. "You should come, it'll be cool," he said, looking right into my eyes. I agreed, even though I usually avoid those kinds of events. We said goodbye, and I watched him disappear around the corner. For the first time, I walked home smiling, feeling like Seattle could be more than just a city. Marco was the reason, and I didn't want to fight it. The exhibition was loud, but Marco made it feel special. We met at the gallery entrance, and his smile instantly eased my nerves. The Capitol Hill Gallery was packed with people discussing paintings, sipping wine from plastic cups. Marco introduced me to his friend Sam, the curator, who talked passionately about every artist. I felt a bit out of place, but Marco stayed close, occasionally touching my shoulder to point out a detail in a painting. His ease made everything simpler, and I caught myself smiling more than usual. After the exhibition, we decided to hit a bar nearby. The place was cozy, with dim lighting and an old jukebox in the corner playing 80s tunes. We ordered beers and slid into a booth, where the conversation flowed even more freely. Marco shared about his childhood in Oregon, how his family didn't always get his choice to pursue photography. I opened up about hiding my orientation from coworkers in Ohio, afraid it would complicate things. We laughed about silly moments from our pasts, but I noticed his hand resting closer to mine on the table. It was subtle, but my heart beat faster. We talked until the bar closed, and without thinking, I suggested we go to my place. My apartment was a couple of blocks away, and we walked in silence, but it was a warm, comfortable silence. When we got inside, I flipped on the light, suddenly aware of how bare my place was: just a couch, a table, and stacks of books. Marco smiled, saying it felt like me. We sat on the couch, and he moved closer. His eyes looked at me so intently that I felt exposed, but I didn't want to pull away. We kissed, and it was slow, careful, like we were both checking if this was real. His hands slid over my shoulders, and I felt the warmth of his body, a closeness I'd been missing. We didn't rush, letting the moment linger. Later, we lay together on my narrow bed, his breath brushing my neck, my hand resting on his chest. No words, just a quiet sense that we weren't strangers anymore. I didn't feel the need to fill the silence, and that was new. Morning came with soft light filtering through the curtains. Marco was still there, his hair messy, his face peaceful. I made coffee, and we sat at the table like it was the most normal thing. There was no awkwardness, just an ease I hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to run from what I was feeling. Marco left around noon, but his look as he said goodbye promised this wasn't the end. I stood by the window, watching the street, and felt something in me shift. Seattle didn't feel so empty anymore. The morning after our night together felt calm, and I didn't want to scare it off. Marco and I sat at my wobbly kitchen table, drinking coffee from old mugs I'd found in a box after moving. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I noticed how it caught in his dark hair. I could still feel the warmth of lying close to him last night, and that feeling softened everything around me. But my mind kept circling. What was this? What comes next? I wasn't used to letting people in so close, and it scared me. I decided to be honest and said, staring into my mug, "You know, I don't usually invite people into my place." The words hung there, and I instantly regretted starting. But Marco smiled, his eyes warm, no trace of mockery. "Me neither, to be honest," he said, his voice as steady as the morning. He shared that after a few rough relationships in Oregon, he'd gotten careful, not wanting to risk his heart again. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. We talked about what we wanted, cautiously, like we were afraid to jinx the moment. I said I didn't know what to call what's between us, but I like how it feels. Marco leaned closer, his hand brushing mine on the table, and said, "I like it too, Ethan, and I don't want to rush this." His words were simple, but they lifted a weight off my shoulders. We didn't promise each other forever or big plans, but something in his look said he wasn't going anywhere. We laughed then, remembering how Lila at the cafe kept winking at us, like she knew we weren't just there for coffee. Marco joked that she's probably already planning our wedding, and I rolled my eyes but couldn't stop smiling. The conversation drifted to little things. He told me about the time he was shooting a sunset and nearly fell into a lake, and I shared how I once fell asleep at my laptop and woke up with a keyboard imprint on my cheek. Those silly stories brought us closer, showing we weren't afraid to be ourselves. When it was time to go, Marco lingered at the door. He looked at me like he wanted to memorize the moment and said, "I'll be back, if that's okay with you." I nodded, warmth spreading through my chest, and said, "I'll be waiting." He left, and I stayed in the apartment, which now felt a little more like home. I sat at my laptop, feeling, for the first time in weeks, like I could write. The words came easily, and I knew it was because of him. Marco didn't promise me the world, but he gave me something bigger, faith that I could open up again. A few weeks passed, and my life started settling into a new rhythm. Marco became part of my world, showing up at my apartment more often, like it was the most natural thing. We saw each other almost every day, talked on the phone when we couldn't meet, and I found myself waiting for his texts. My small Seattle apartment, once so empty, now felt alive. His camera sat on my desk, his jacket hung over a chair, and it made the space cozier. I was still working on my book, but the words came easier now, like Marco brought inspiration with him. One evening, we sat on the couch, reading the same book, arguing about what soundtrack would fit the story. I pushed for something moody, like old jazz, while he suggested something bright with guitars. We laughed, cutting each other off, and I noticed his hand resting on my knee, like it was the most effortless gesture. Later, he grabbed his camera and started snapping photos of me while I pretended to read. "You look better when you don't know you're in the frame," he said with a grin, and I rolled my eyes, but inside, I warmed at his words. We spent time in the little things that added up to something bigger. In the mornings, he'd make coffee while I tried not to burn the toast, and we'd eat at the table, sharing plans for the day. Sometimes he stayed over and I got used to the feeling of him next to me. His breathing, the warmth of his skin as we fell asleep together. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet closeness that made my days fuller. I felt the walls I'd built over years slowly crumbling, and it didn't scare me, it felt freeing. One day, we walked through a park, and Marco was photographing trees, saying the autumn light in Seattle was something special. I watched him, the way he focused, and realized he wasn't just someone I was seeing anymore. He was part of my life, part of how I saw this city now. I told him that, a bit awkwardly, and he stopped, looked at me, and said, "You make this city better for me too." His voice was earnest, and I felt something in my chest tighten with happiness. We didn't call it a relationship, didn't slap labels on it, but something real was growing between us. Lila at the cafe now greeted us like a couple, teasing that we always ordered the same thing. Even Sam, Marco's friend, once said we looked like we'd always been together. I didn't argue, because it felt true. Seattle, which once seemed cold and foreign to me, was now home, and Marco was a big part of that. We were lying in my apartment, and the silence felt almost tangible. Marco was beside me, his head resting on my chest, and I stared at the ceiling, feeling his breath warm against my skin. Outside, Seattle hummed, but here, in this room, everything felt calm, real. The past few weeks with Marco had changed me, but that evening, something inside told me we needed to talk. Not about small things, not about books or coffee, but about what really mattered. I wasn't sure I was ready, but the words were already pushing to get out. Marco shifted and looked at me, his eyes dark and attentive. "What is this to you?" he asked softly, his voice gentle but serious. The question caught me off guard, and my heart started pounding. I could have joked, changed the subject, but instead I took a deep breath and said, "It's the only thing that feels real since I got here." My words felt raw, vulnerable, but I didn't want to take them back. He nodded, like he'd been expecting it, and his hand squeezed mine a little tighter. We started talking about the fears we usually keep locked away. I admitted I'm scared of ending up alone again, that every time I open up, I brace for everything to fall apart. My life in Ohio was full of those moments. People came and went, leaving me to pick up the pieces. Marco listened without interrupting, and I saw something in his eyes that urged me to keep going. He shared his own fears, how he'd been rejected by people he trusted, how he worried he'd never be accepted for who he is. His voice wavered, and I felt my hand instinctively reach to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. We lay there, sharing what we usually hide, and it didn't break us. Instead, every word, every glance, pulled us closer. I told him that with him, I don't feel the need to hide, and he smiled, saying, "You make me feel the same way." His words were simple, but they settled in my heart, warm and steady. We didn't promise each other perfection, but in that moment, I knew we were ready to keep going together. Later, we got up, made tea, and the conversation lightened. We joked about how Lila at the cafe probably already had nicknames for us and bickered over what movie to watch before bed. But even in those lighter moments, I felt our talk had shifted something. We weren't just two people hanging out anymore, we were something more, a team ready to face fears head-on. Seattle buzzed outside, but now it was ours, and I knew we'd handle it. 5 months flew by, and my life with Marco became more than I could have dreamed. We didn't officially call ourselves a couple, but we lived together, sharing my small Seattle apartment that now felt like a real home. His toothbrush sat next to mine in the bathroom, his t-shirts filled my closet, and his camera often lay on the kitchen table. Every morning we drank coffee at the table, arguing over which playlist to play, me for jazz, him for something with guitars. Those simple moments became the foundation of our world, and I no longer felt like a stranger in this city. Our life flowed naturally, and I cherished how effortlessly it came together. Evenings, we'd sprawl on the couch, me reading drafts of my book, Marco editing photos. Sometimes he'd show me a picture and ask what I saw. I'd spin stories about the people in his shots, and he'd laugh, saying I should write scripts. Those moments were so warm I forgot how lonely I'd been before him. His presence made everything easier, even when I tangled with deadlines or doubted myself. One evening, we made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta with Jared sauce, but we turned it into an event. Marco put on an old album, and we danced in the kitchen while the water boiled. He grabbed my waist, spun me around, and I laughed, pretending I wanted to break free. Later, we ate on the floor because the table was buried under books, and he looked at me, saying, "You don't look lost anymore." His words hit me right in the heart, and I said, "Because I'm not alone anymore." His smile was so genuine I wanted to hold on to that moment forever. We didn't shy away from tough talks, but they strengthened us now. One day, I asked if he thought about the future, where we were headed. He stirred his coffee, thought for a moment, and said, "I don't know where we'll be in a year, but I want to be with you." His honesty was so straightforward it gave me confidence. I admitted I sometimes worry things are too good, that I don't deserve it. He took my hand and said, "You deserve everything, Ethan, and I'll keep reminding you." Those words became an anchor I leaned on when doubts crept in. Our friends, Lila and Sam, became part of our life. Lila at the cafe greeted us like a couple, winking when we ordered coffee. Sam invited us to an exhibition where Marco showed his work for the first time. I stood beside him as he explained his photos to strangers, feeling pride mixed with something deeper, hard to name. His pictures were so alive, and I saw his heart in them, the same heart he'd opened to me. Some nights, we just lay together, his hand on my shoulder, and I listened to him breathe. Those moments were quiet but full, and I knew that's what love was. Not loud, not perfect, but real. We folded laundry, bickered over whose turn it was to do dishes, and laughed when I kept losing socks. Those days were our story, and I didn't want to change a thing. One day, I finished the first draft of my book. I showed it to Marco, nervously fidgeting with my shirt. He read it and said, "This is you, Ethan, this is your soul." His words gave me the courage to send the manuscript to a publisher. I wasn't afraid of being seen anymore, because he'd already seen me, all of me, no masks. Seattle became our city. We walked its streets hand in hand, and I didn't look over my shoulder, worried about who might be watching. Marco taught me to see beauty in the small things, in the glow of streetlights, in the laughter of passers-by, in our morning talks. I wasn't the guy hiding in a bookstore cafe anymore. I was with him, and that was enough. But I keep thinking, what helped me open up to Marco despite my fears? What moments in other people's lives made them feel they'd found their home? And how would you describe a love built on simple, everyday things like ours?